1 in 3 people have insulin resistance in the United States, and that doubles your risk of developing depression, even if you have had no psychiatric history.
This is this sort of weird moment in psychiatry where I think we're converging these two massive paradigm shifts. One is around psychedelic medicine, metabolic psychiatry, and you can't do one without the other.
Dr. Shebani Sethi
is the founding director of
Stanford's Metabolic Psychiatry Program,
where she unites nutrition,
metabolism, and mental health care. She's rewriting mental health
by fixing the body first.
What is metabolic psychiatry?
Metabolic psychiatry is thinking about metabolism and mental health connection, but it's the study of all of the metabolic dysfunctions, both systemic as well as central. So you can have dysfunction in the brain and you can have dysfunction outside the brain in the body, and those two elements are important in thinking about how that affects psychiatric disease and mental health.
The thing that I think people are wondering about is, where do I start? Like, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, maybe I have bipolar disease, maybe I've got a form of schizophrenia. Like, what do I do?
Hey, it's Dr. Hyman. I'm so excited to share this episode with you today, but before we dive in, I want to get your help. Please take a minute to hit that subscribe button, whether you're watching here on YouTube or listening on your favorite podcast platform. It truly means the world to me, and it helps my team and I bring you this podcast every single week. Plus, I don't want you to miss a thing. So thanks so much for being part of this community, and I'm glad you're here.
Welcome, Shebani, to the podcast. It's good to have you back. We had a chance to talk about your work a few years ago, and I just wanted to revisit it because it's such an important piece of work you're doing in the world to look at mental health from a new lens, which is how the body affects the brain. It's something that, is kind of this weird anomaly in psychiatry because historically, psychiatrists never looked at the body. I mean, the joke in medicine is neurologists pay no attention to the mind and psychiatrists pay no attention to the brain. And also, I would say psychiatrists pay no attention to the body in terms of what's happening that could be influencing the brain. You're sort of highlighting the opposite of the mind-body effect, which is the body-mind effect. And it's bidirectional, but mostly we focus on the mind-body effect. Yes, stress can cause illness and so forth, but physiological changes in the body that are emerging because of our lifestyle and our crappy diet and stress and toxins and all these things have an effect on the brain. And we really have neglected this area. And the body has only so many ways of saying ouch, and the brain even less. When your knee hurts, if you sprain your knee, it hurts, right? But if your brain is inflamed, what happens? It doesn't hurt. They don't get a headache. It creates mental illness. And so I want to unpack with you today this whole field that you sort of are deeply involved in, that you coined the term for, which is metabolic psychiatry. So maybe you can start out by saying, how did you come up with this? Where did it originate from in your mind, and what is metabolic psychiatry?
Well, thank you, Mark, for having me back on your show. You actually wrote a book 20 years ago or 15 years ago, making some of these connections. And
the Ultra Mind Solution, right?
Here we are 15 and 20 years later talking about it.
Yeah.
These ideas of metabolism and mental health being connected, they're not new. They've been around for 100 years. 100 years ago in psychiatry, we had seen that there were levels of lactate that were elevated in serious mental illness, and that there were levels of glutathione, which were low. They were low, and it is an antioxidant. And so these markers were markers of bioenergetic dysfunction. And so
lactate is like when you exercise too much and your calves hurt because you've got lactic acid in your muscles. That's happening in your brain.
And so there's also a preferential area of energy production towards glycolysis that produces lactate, and that tends to be more common in certain diseases. So we see that in neurodegenerative conditions. We see that in serious mental illness like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major depression. So when I say serious mental illness, I'm talking about these 3 illnesses primarily.
Yeah.
Knowing that these were biomarkers that we saw 100 years ago, and then we went in different directions over the last 100 years, focused on neurotransmitters and, other systems, which are only just part of the picture. There's a much bigger picture when we think about metabolism. So metabolism is really just thinking about food breakdown into energy, and everything that happens in between is detail. Metabolic psychiatry is thinking about that metabolism and mental health connection, but it's the study of all of the metabolic dysfunctions, both systemic as well as central. So you can have dysfunction in the brain and you can have dysfunction outside the brain in the body. They're connected, right? And those two elements are important in thinking about how that affects psychiatric disease and mental health. And so when we look at how that dysfunction affects psychiatric symptoms, whether it's prevention, whether it's progression of disease or treatment of disease, that's really what metabolic psychiatry is about. I think other instances, metabolic psychiatry has been defined as brain energy metabolism only, or it's been defined as just the ketogenic diet, for example. And I want to clear that up because metabolic psychiatry really is a more holistic term that incorporates all systemic as well as central metabolic dysfunction and how that affects psychiatric disease.
Yeah, so just for people listening, in medicine, we talk about metabolism, and people say I have a slow metabolism. In the lay culture, or I have fast metabolism. They mean a little bit different things. So metabolism is, yes, how you eat food and it converts into energy, but there's an enormous number of metabolic pathways. If you were to put on a wall in basically microprint, it would be a giant wall, all the metabolic pathways, these set of things we see in medical school. And every single one of those pathways are part of the biochemical reactions that happen across every system in your body. And there's 37 billion trillion chemical reactions every second in your body. All those are part of your metabolic system. And all those things, I think, affect our mental health and everything else in terms of disease. So understanding that is really important. And it's kind of a neglected thing in medicine. We sort of give lip service to it in the first year of medical school. We pretty much ignore it after that. We don't learn much about things like insulin resistance, but even less about nutrition, which is driving a lot of the metabolic systems, right? Because every one of those biochemical pathways requires a nutrient to actually work. So in a sense, metabolic psychiatry, you're saying, is the bigger rubric that encompasses all of that, not just sugar and glucose and metabolism from that perspective, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think that's important to understand. And those metabolic pathways affect everything. So it's very complicated. We kind of like look at that chart and maybe learn a little bit about it, but it's kind of not this thing that we pay attention to. But it ends up being the kind of, I would say, holy grail of how to actually think about health in general, and particularly psychiatry. And the fact that you sort of are pointing to the fact that the way we thought about mental illness might not be totally accurate. And I think this is part of the problem in our society is that, if someone has rheumatoid arthritis, their joints are damaged, we don't say, oh, there's something wrong with you. Like we go, oh, too bad. I'm sorry you're suffering from this. Like, how can I help? With mental health, there's a lot of stigma around it. And there's a lot of judgment around it. And there's a lot of attribution of meaning to it. And I think through history, there's been this phenomena of different views of mental illness throughout history. And I think we're in this new era of understanding mental illness through the lens of metabolic psychiatry. And also, I don't know what you call it, trauma-informed psychiatry or, psychedelic medicine, which is addressing a lot of these other aspects.
Yeah, I think the dean of our medical school at Stanford Medicine had said, I think during a medical school graduation, that the greatest discoveries are discovered in this intersection between fields. And sometimes I think we forget that the body is related and, organs are not just isolated and they're working in a whole system.
Yeah.
So, if your city is, running and it's not, if there's a issue in the power grid and you're not having enough power and the light's flickering somewhere, there's something that's wrong. And even though it's working, it's not working optimally. And so metabolic psychiatry takes different fields of endocrinology, immunology, and so forth. And we really wanted to have, at Stanford, we wanted to put a name to it so that more clinicians and researchers and people out there do more work in this area.
Yeah.
It really gives us a communication tool and map to be able to label something and to be able to work in a more collaborative way.
And the truth is, for the serious mental illnesses that you're talking about, I mean, people suffer from anxiety, depression, major depression, more serious psychiatric illnesses from that spectrum. But then there's things like schizophrenia and bipolar disease, which are pretty intractable and chronic, and the medications come with a lot of downside effects. And obesity, it kind of makes it even worse. We're seeing, studies that show in some of the work you've done that you see profound changes in these untreatable mental illnesses using this approach of metabolic psychiatry, nutrition, and food. Can you kind of talk about how did you, because you kind of came from the field of obesity medicine and also psychiatric medicine. So was that what kind of got you thinking about this? Or
Yeah, so for me, I think I was one of those really lucky at an early point in my career when I was in medical school. I had exposure to nutrition, which usually is not typical. I think normally it's maybe 2 days of lectures of nutrition in medical school, although I'm optimistic it's changing. I had an opportunity to really delve more into obesity medicine starting in medical school, and that got me very interested in nutrition as well because I started seeing differences in patients when it came to psychiatric symptoms. And one patient in particular who had schizophrenia and treatment-resistant schizophrenia, I spent a lot of time talking to these patients in an obesity clinic. From there, I learned more about obesity treatments. And so I really just follow my heart. In a lot of ways, I didn't have plans to be a physician scientist or an entrepreneur. I just had plans to treat patients, and I did that, and I really enjoy it. But I felt that a lot of times these things were not being treated, whether it was metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance or metabolic issues. And I thought it would be, helpful to do that. And so I started really with a strong interest, and that just led me with my curiosity to go further into obesity medicine. I knew I wanted to do psychiatry, and I went into psychiatry with an interest in metabolism. So I veered towards obesity medicine because that was what I had a great mentor in medical school, and I went in that direction. He was an obesity medicine specialist. And from there, that's how I learned about ketogenic therapies for seizures. And then I worked with some of the folks who are neurologists who do that for epilepsy, and then understood how I could adapt it for psychiatric conditions. And then I started studying that. I did it with my patients. I started studying it. And here I am many years later doing research trials. And I started a program at Stanford, which is focused on metabolism-based interventions for those with bipolar or schizophrenia or depression, and also eating disorders. I had done some work in eating disorders and trials and with obesity drugs. And I have realized over time that there are other options and tools, which I do believe is important to integrate into psychiatry. I felt that it was missing, that we oftentimes kind of segregate ourselves a little too much from other fields, and there's so much connection and relationship. And I'll give you one example. So in primary care, I saw a lot of patients that had diabetes, right? Diabetes or hypertension. But the folks that had the more severe depression tended to have insulin resistance, or they had some other metabolic condition. And so in primary care, the folks with diabetes who weren't doing well had depression. So that's the thing that I saw. And then I just got more curious about this and that connection.
Yeah, there's a big crossover. Like about 40% of people with diabetes have mental illness, right?
It's pretty high. So in bipolar illness, about 37, almost 40% have metabolic syndrome.
Pre-diabetes, essentially,
Full-blown metabolic syndrome. If you have insulin resistance, 1 in 3 people have insulin resistance in the United States. And that doubles your risk of developing depression, even if you have had no psychiatric history. So there's a lot of relationships.
And it depends on how you define prediabetes too, because I think if you look at some of the work out of Tufts, they looked at people with what they sort of determined was metabolic dysfunction, which is either you have a high blood sugar, high blood pressure, abnormal cholesterol, you're overweight or obese, or you've had a heart attack or stroke. And if you combine all those, which are all related to the fundamental biology of insulin resistance, which I want to unpack with you, that's 93.2% of Americans. So it's more than 1 in 3 that have some degree of this. That's concerning to me because our diet is so bad. It's so high in sugar and starch. It's such a destructive force for not only our body, but also our brain. And people don't understand that. People don't understand that, yeah, okay, I guess if I eat too many cookies or have too much soda, I'll gain weight and I'll get overweight. But they don't connect the dots with mental health. And I think, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. The more depressed you are, the less likely you are to take care of yourself, and you spiral. And that's what happens a lot in these patients. So can you talk about like the dive into this whole phenomenon of insulin resistance in the brain and how it affects you and how it's somehow different than in peripheral insulin resistance? Could you talk about like cerebral hypometabolism, which means low metabolism in the brain, right? And how it affects the brain and how insulin resistance plays a role in this. Can you sort of unpack that?
So cerebral glucose hypometabolism in the brain globally is a central pathological characteristic of neurodegenerative conditions and also present in schizophrenia and bipolar in particular. And that's really when the certain areas of the brain cannot use glucose for energy. Even though glucose is present, it can't process the glucose well. And you develop insulin resistance as well. And when you have insulin resistance centrally, there's a problem with insulin signaling and glucose signaling in the brain. And we see this even before the diagnosis of psychosis. Before medications are given and before the diagnosis, it's present. So we think there's a relationship between psychiatric illness and insulin and glucose handling in the brain. When you have insulin resistance in the brain, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have insulin resistance in the body. Measures of that differ. And a lot of the medications that we tend to use in psychiatry, unfortunately, some of them do have effects on insulin resistance peripherally, which is different than insulin resistance centrally. It can affect the hypothalamus, the nuclei in the hypothalamus. It can increase food intake. So it increases your appetite.
Hungry, yeah.
Yeah, it makes you hungrier. And with the peripherally, it can increase insulin so that you are releasing more insulin and become insulin resistant by nature of the medication. But there's also elements of the medication that occur in the brain as well, where it improves insulin signaling depending on the drug. So it's actually kind of complicated. And I'll give you an example is lithium. It also improves insulin signaling in the brain. But to get back to, this insulin resistance concept in the brain and why it's really important because it's important for neuronal plasticity, neuronal growth, remodeling, shaping. Insulin signaling is critical for that. It's one of the reasons why it's important. When you have insulin resistance peripherally, so outside the brain, it leads to degeneration and atrophy of some of the hippocampal neurons as well. And so it's structurally altering the brain when you have insulin resistance peripherally. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the insulin resistance centrally is doing that. It's the peripheral insulin resistance that's leading to that. So there is this bidirectional relationship that you mentioned earlier. And that bidirectional relationship is that, on one side, if you have type 2 diabetes or obesity or insulin resistance, it's leading to symptoms, psychiatric symptoms. It leads to a psychiatric diagnosis eventually. It's affecting the brain. But then there's also intrinsic metabolic dysfunction, and insulin resistance is part of that in psychiatric disease that then leads to HPA axis dysregulation, or it leads to sleep disturbances, and it leads to the obvious peripheral signs of metabolic dysfunction as well.
So basically what you're saying in English is that you've got the insulin resistance in the body that affects the brain structurally. It can shrink memory centers and other key areas of the brain that make it not work well. But you can also have the psychiatric symptoms making you have worsened ability to regulate blood sugar and insulin peripherally too, because it affects your stress response. It affects your whole metabolic system.
Yes, in addition to medication side effects and so forth, but even the intrinsic metabolic dysfunction that exists in psychiatric conditions can also make someone more vulnerable in developing those other conditions.
And when you look at type 2 diabetics, their mitochondria function at half the rate at as regular people who don't have type 2 diabetes. So mitochondria are essentially the little energy factories inside your cells, and there's anywhere from hundreds to thousands and tens of thousands in the brain. It's the most dense. Per brain cell is the most mitochondria of any cell in your body. So energy is really important in the brain. What we find is if you're a type 2 diabetic or if you have insulin resistance, your mitochondria don't work as well. And that creates a whole downstream set of consequences. It can create more oxidative stress. It potentially can create more inflammation. And it's also inflammation can cause mitochondrial dysfunction. So it's a kind of virtuous or maybe a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle of dysfunction.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that you can create a virtuous cycle by the interventions that you're finding with your team and group at Stanford, looking at metabolic interventions of diet, nutrition, like keto diets, for helping reset the brain energy system.
Generally, there's 4 mechanisms of metabolic disease. There's plasticity, you mentioned, the inflammation, there's oxidative stress, and there's mitochondrial dysfunction. And so anything that's going to target these areas, whether it's a diet or whether it's medications that target these pathways, there is a potential for improving both the metabolic disease and the psychiatric disease, because there's a shared relationship. There's a shared pathogenic relationship between mental health and metabolism.
Yeah.
So that's really what we're studying, and that's what we're trying to go further into with a lot of mechanistic studies, as well as looking at clinical outcomes and metabolic markers and so forth. I can go into that in detail, but
I think the inflammation piece is really important, because when you look at people with type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, they often have a high C-reactive protein, a marker of inflammation, and they often have systemic inflammation. And when we start to look at all these neurodegenerative and neuropsychiatric illnesses, a common feature is inflammation. And I've even seen some stupid studies looking at like TNF-alpha blockers for depression, which is like, a drug we use for rheumatoid arthritis or severe autoimmune diseases. It's $50,000 a year and there's a lot of side effects. And they're saying, well, it's inflammation in the brain. Let's give you an anti-inflammatory, but it doesn't work like that. I think we have to think about what's causing the inflammation, get to the root cause of it. And it's this metabolic dysfunction that tends to be both the cause and the consequence of it.
Yeah. And I think we can think about all of these, whether they're drugs or even diets, they're different tools in the toolbox that we can use to target a metabolic pathway or an improvement in symptoms. For example, you could take metformin. A lot of us know, right? Metformin improves glucose. It improves insulin sensitivity, but it also crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it has a neuroprotective effect. It helps in the TCA cycle. Within the mitochondria, we have machinery to produce energy, to produce ATP, and there are deficits in that energy pathway, whether they're enzymes or cofactors, they're not present. Metformin helps support that to some degree, and it also does decrease inflammation. So in some studies, it's been shown to reduce TNF-alpha, reduce interleukin-6, reduce other cytokines. And we know cytokines also are pro-inflammatory, right? And they end up also affecting serotonin synthesis. It affects tryptophan metabolism.
Yeah.
Hey, that's neurotransmitter, right? And that's one part, but that's one part of the equation.
Yeah.
And so there was a study a colleague of mine did looking at metformin and treatment-resistant bipolar depression, and that showed an improvement in those who were treated with metformin and also had the psychiatric medication on board. It allowed the psychiatric medication on board to work better. So that's just one example of how a metabolic intervention or tool can improve psychiatric symptoms that goes beyond just let's improve insulin resistance, but there's so many other pieces that are also being affected by it.
And basically what you're talking about is up until now, most of psychiatry has been sort of downstream. Like the neurotransmitters may be a problem, but the question is, why are they so messed up in the first place? Right? And what's causing that? And it seems like what your work is finding is that a lot of our lifestyle and diet-related problems that are driving blood sugar dysregulation and mitochondrial dysfunction, inflammation, our ultra-processed diet and sedentary lifestyle, and all these things that sort of accelerate the problem, actually
exactly
make these sort of neurotransmitter problems worse downstream. And you can treat the neurotransmitters or you can treat the cause, right?
Yeah.
You can treat the symptom or you can treat the cause. And I think the metabolic psychiatry approach, like you said, has many tools, like metformin is a drug that helps improve it. But there are many other things, right, that are including diet, lifestyle, exercise, we know is very effective for mental health. And how does that work? It may partly work by improving insulin sensitivity, right?
Yeah, that's one. And, increasing BDNF, which you and I talked about last time, I think, on your show, like now 5 years ago. The time has flown. But you described it as miracle grow, and I really love the way you described it because it's exactly what it is. That was one, with exercise, that it's shown to, improve those levels and improve cognition and so forth. So there's a lot of tools.
And the mitochondrial therapies, there's a woman named Suzanne Go who's looked at a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction, autistic brains. And whether you have ADD or autism or you have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or depression or bipolar schizophrenia, it's all this spectrum of brain dysfunction. And there's a lot of common pathways involved in all these. And her work has found that, there's energy deficits in these kids in the brain, and it may show up in one subset of people as autism, another subset is schizophrenia, but essentially it's the same mechanism. She talks about using mitochondrial therapies, essentially cofactors that are involved in these metabolic steps, these biochemical steps require helpers. And so they use nutrients like amino acids or CoQ10 or other compounds that actually help improve brain function. So I wonder, are you exploring any of these sort of nutraceutical approaches that are using the body's own things that uses to actually make energy, but giving them in sort of higher doses or through supplementation as a tool for helping metabolic psychiatry patients?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I love her work, by the way. And I think looking at mitochondrial dysfunction, it's a lot of shared mechanisms with these different conditions. So it does make sense when we're studying serious mental illness and other conditions to be looking at vitamins, cofactors, things. So we test for that in our clinic. We test for all of these things and we optimize. So we have an approach that we use to make sure that people are not deficient in these things. Because if someone's deficient, does that make sense to treat them only with medication and ignore the fact that they're deficient or malnourished in some way? If they have insulin resistance, obesity, or metabolic syndrome, sure, let's treat that. But let's make sure they're also not malnourished. Most of them are malnourished. And you mentioned 90-something% of the population is having some kind of metabolic abnormality.
Overfed and undernourished.
Right, yeah.
Too many calories, not enough nutrients,
It's almost like a crime to not be thinking about it. And that's why I think it's really important to have that approach. And to answer your question, while I'm not specifically looking at one supplement and its effect on psychiatric outcomes, I'm really looking at the whole picture and making sure they're optimized. Give an example of research that's been done in our field by colleagues who looked at omega-3 supplementation, at least 1 gram, including EPA, per day for, I think it was a total of 8 to 12 weeks period, which significantly had it was modest evidence that showed benefit for psychosis, early phase schizophrenia, early phase psychosis. And it's also been a treatment as an adjunctive treatment for depression. Things like this are helpful for us to know about. It unfortunately didn't have the same effect for chronic schizophrenia. But that's why prevention is so important. And mentioned earlier about fasting insulin, right? And development of depression, like why aren't we checking these things more routinely or more frequently to prevent conditions or prevent exacerbation of, symptoms that are so severe like psychosis?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're bringing up is important. And medicine's very reductionist. And let's look at omega-3s. Let's look at vitamin D. Let's look at magnesium. Let's look at whatever B vitamins. And the body is so complex that it requires all the ingredients. And it's like if you want to grow a healthy plant, you can't just have soil. You need water and light, and vice versa. So, like the human body is very much the same way. And I think we often will not be sophisticated in how we think about providing all the components needed for optimal function of mitochondria, of your immune system, of insulin resistance. And I think that one way to navigate that is sort of emerging from our understanding of metabolomics and proteomics and gene expression products that are helping us understand the body in a more nuanced way.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I think a lot about is what are the biomarkers of mental illness? And what are the things we should be looking at that can play a role? Rather than just treating one thing, you have to find everything that's off and fix it. In other words, if your omega-3 is low and you take it, great.